morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are in week 13 of the semester, so we have 3 more classes to go. And now we are dealing mostly with the 19th century. We have quite a lot of smaller subjects concerning the private life in the 19th century. I'll be basing my discussion mostly on the book that I use quite a lot in my 19th century courses. That is Sally Mitchell's Daily Life in Victorian England. So if you want to read more, this is probably the most advisable book on this subject. She writes a lot about practical matters, about the reality of daily life, not only in the private sphere, but quite a lot of the chapters are devoted to private sphere. So we'll be dealing with family and social rituals, leisure, and such matters. So let's start with the first subject, namely the role of children in the 19th century family, and especially to what extent the practices of private life regarding childcare have changed since the previous periods. So I hope you have seen the parts of the art course, especially those regarding the representations in painting of children and animals, and if you compare them with the similar representation from the 18th century, the difference is, I hope, evident. So that in the 18th century, the upper sections of the society had to be convinced by philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau that children were interesting subjects, that children were deserving of their attention, at least as much as their pets. In the 19th century, nobody needs to convince the dominant groups in the society about that. For the Victorians, childcare and especially the role of the mother were, at least theoretically, the most important thing in a woman's life. You might say, using a modern word, a word from modern cultural theory, that Victorian society was repronormative. It means that the questions of reproduction, the questions of having children, caring for children were absolutely normalized. So they were treated as something not only natural, but something that is ubiquitous, something that is characteristic of all healthy people. They all, according to this viewpoint, wanted to have children. They all were interested in child rearing. So that would be definitely a big change. The change that is, of course, the result of decades of social and also economical developments from the 18th century to the mid-19th century. So especially the dominant social role of the middle class. This is one of those things in which the middle class really started to dictate their view of the world. So the ideal of the non-working mother, whose role was to look after children and the division of the spheres really resulted in the creation of the Victorian way of life. The practice was somewhat different because everybody who had the means to do it employed servants, and they were the live-in servants. Yes. Okay, so there were some noises in the background, so we continue now where we stopped in the previous video. Of course, as with many aspects of Victorian culture, the practice was quite different than the theory, and of course, most people from the middle class, definitely all that could afford it, had domestic servants. These were live-in servants, so servants who shared the living space with the employers. If we compare the situation with domestic service in the 18th century and in the 19th century, probably in the 19th century there would be many more families who could afford employing servants, in the middle class this was one of the most important status symbols. You basically couldn't count your family to belong to the middle class if you could not employ even one servant. But evidently, the majority of the families, middle class families, who employed servants could afford only one such servant, usually a young female servant called the maid of all work. So she would do whatever was asked of her, the lady of the house would have to take part in the chores herself. Sally Mitchell has a very interesting chapter on domestic service, and you have quite a lot of practical information. For example, to be completely spared the necessity of doing housework yourself if you were the lady of the house, you needed at least 3 servants in the house, living permanently in the house. This gives you some idea about the amount of work that living in the Victorian world, in the Victorian city, necessitated. So first of all, everything had to be done by hand from scratch in the kitchen. So cooking and preparing food and cleaning dishes, cleaning the kitchen required a lot more labor. Also, the fact that Victorian homes were heated by coal fires, by fireplaces using coal mostly, meant that there was a lot more dust in the air, and basically the cleaning of the house also required a lot more attention, a lot more work on the daily basis. So basically there would be a general cleaning every day if you wanted to have your house in the spotless condition, which again was a very important status symbol for the Victorians. And then you may recall that the number of children in a typical Victorian family was between 5 and 6 in the middle of the century, so probably there would be another servant necessary to help care for the children. At least 3 live-in servants to help the wife care for the household, care for the family. Speaking of larger households, of course, you might have, I don't know, between 10 and 20 or perhaps even more people employed in the household. If you recall productions such as Downton Abbey, which is set at the very late stage of this world, so the beginning of the 20th century rather than the 19th century, but it follows in the tradition of Victorian grand houses, so an aristocratic house, the estate having the grounds, having the garden, would also have the army of servants, very hierarchical, and there would be actually even some servants who didn't do any physical work themselves. They only supervised other servants. such as the butler, who would supervise the male servants. That was again a status symbol in Victorian households. And the housekeeper, who would supervise the female servants. So this would be a very hierarchical community, sometimes living in a kind of parallel world to the employer. But in the majority of Victorian middle-class houses, there would be just a few servants. If you could employ three, so that the wife would only do the supervision, the managerial work, she would supervise the cook and perhaps two more servants, the nurse for the children and the housemaid who would clean the house. This was really a very important mark of the status. So coming back to the question of children, most children in the rich households were still in the care of servants predominantly. However, it was connected with some expectations from the mother, who, as you may recall from Victorian art, for example, was glorified as the primary caregiver to the children, and also a kind of moral guide, a moral instructor to the children. So this was the difference between theory and practice. So the richer the household, the more care, daily care, like feeding and cleaning the children, would be left in the hands of the servants. Also, the education of children, of course, the richer parents would be responsible for educating the children themselves, which would mean that mostly boys would be sent to schools if the family could afford it. The prestigious, the so-called public schools, such as Eton or Harrow, so some of them would be really the springboards for future university education and eventually a career in the establishment of the 19th century. But before being sent to school, and in the case of girls very often as well, the education, the primary education of children was in the hands of kinds of servants, that is governesses, who were employed by the family, and it all depended on the budget and the care given by the family in the employment of the governess. It could be someone with a lot of knowledge and someone skilled skilled in teaching, so someone who could transmit the knowledge to the children quite well, or someone who would just teach them, I don't know, good table manners, which was a very important thing in Victorian world, especially for girls. So the education of girls was probably better than in the 18th century in terms of general availability and general literacy, but still it was secondary to the education of boys, and the primary function of education, again more visible in the higher social classes, was to prepare the girls for marriage, for motherhood, for being hostesses, so for social functions. So they would be taught music, dancing, and the so-called accomplishments. Accomplishments were basically hobbies, usually including some crafts or handiwork that were considered very ladylike pursuits, something to occupy the time for the ladies after they married in the evenings. So They didn't have radio, didn't have television. The only thing they could do was to sit together, perhaps enjoy some group reading. This was quite a popular thing. We'll talk about it when we talk about the leisure activities in the 19th century. But also all kinds of handicrafts were very popular and they were considered very ladylike. So there are quite a lot of television programs, mostly made by the BBC, in which professionals and volunteers try to recreate various aspects of life in the 19th century. There is a series called The Victorian Kitchen, and that there is the Victorian Farm and the Victorian Pharmacy, and there is probably the first one of this series called 19th Century House. Oh no, 1900 house. This is a house that was set to represent the life at the turn of the century, so you would have a family recreating the conditions of living in the 1900 house. Google that, perhaps see some episodes, and you'll see how the daily life of the families and the family servants really looked on the daily basis. And we continue in a moment.